three speakers today are all going to be speaking on Lviv, some aspect of Lviv. We have, of course, Yuri Vynnychuk, who is rounding out a month-long sort of series of lectures in the United States. It started out with Columbia, and went Penn State, and maybe Canada, somewhere in between there, and finishing up with us. He is, of course, a popular Ukrainian writer, as well as a political commentator, and a very sharp political commentator as well. And of course, we have Vitaly Chernetsky, who is Slavic languages and literatures, who specializes in Ukrainian and Russian 20th and 21st century literature. And I've taken the liberty also of printing out some posters for the Soviet and Russian cinema courses he's going to be teaching. And finally, John Biersack, who is an MA grad, but also a geography PhD candidate, and spent time most recently in Lviv working on material for a dissertation on Ukrainian identity.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So the way we have decided to organize our roundtable is that we'll be bringing you three different perspectives on this, one of Europe's and the world's most beautiful, fascinating cities with its dramatic history and very interesting present. We will first hear the perspective of our guest, Yuri Vynnychuk, who is probably the most knowledgeable person in the literary and cultural world about the city of Lviv and its past traditions, from the street culture to high culture. He will be speaking in Ukrainian, I will be translating into English, and I will then add some of my perspective on how, as an academic born in Ukraine but teaching now for many years in the United States, what it feels like to study that place, what it feels like to bring students there. And then we'll pass the torch to John, who will show his perspective as a KU person who's had the long association and interest in the city, and he will share with us what he has discovered. And then we will hopefully have enough time for a good and lively discussion that is going to involve all of you present here as well. So without further ado, може розповіш, як на твою думку, якщо ти перед аудиторією людей, що ніколи ще у Львові не були, тільки про Львів чули, як їм коротко охарактеризувати, чому це місто таке унікальне, чим воно настільки цікаве, чому воно так приваблює людей?
Львів за своєю багатокультурністю можна порівняти з Трієстом, Прагою, до деякими мірами з Парижем.
Lviv, most importantly, is a city of great cultural diversity. In its multicultural aspect, it can be compared to such historically great Central European cities as Prague or Trieste, and even, let's be more ambitious, we can even talk about Paris.
Чотири основних народи будували це місто і творили його культуру. Це німці, поляки, євреї і українці.
And the four main groups, ethnic groups, four nations that built it together were Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, and Germans.
Король Данило Галицький, який заснував це місто, запросив багатьох німецьких отців і загалом міщан німецьких, які оселилися у Львові, і в середньовіччі це місто було більше німецьке, ніж українське.
Grand Duke and the first king of Kievan Rus lands, King Danilo of Galicia, invited many German merchants and craftsmen into the city that he founded, and therefore already in the early Middle Ages, the city, even though it was part of East Slavic lands, it had a very large German community, and so already in the early medieval times, this is a city with, if you can say, was more German than Ukrainian in its early character.
З 15 століття у Львові почали переважати поляки, і вже творилася культура і польська, і русинська однаковою мірою.
Starting in the 15th century, Poles begin to constitute the largest community among the city residents. However, the traditional East Slavic, as at the time was known, Ruthenian culture continued to be actively produced there as well.
І тут вже Львів можна порівняти з Дубровником, бо в ньому творилася література відродження і бароко, архітектура, поезія, мистецтво, музика.
And at that time, during the Renaissance and early Baroque period, Lviv can be compared to Dubrovnik on the Dalmatian coast in modern-day Croatia, which was also a city that synthesized Western and East European influences and had a great literary, musical, and artistic tradition and great architectural monuments constructed during that period.
Зараз ця література перекладена українською з латинки, з польської, з німецької, з давньоукраїнської.
Now we have done considerable efforts to make those texts available. Those texts at the time were written in the Old East Slavic, in Latin and Polish and in German, but we now also have good translations into modern standard Ukrainian of all those texts.
Місто ще тим цікаве, що є кілька хронік міських, в яких детально описано життя міста. І також є описано дуже детально облоги міста, коли татари його облягали з турками, а потім козаки.
We are fortunate in that many chronicles have survived from that period in the city's history, so we have detailed records of how the city lived, and detailed records of some more turbulent moments in its history, such as the sieges of the city by the Tatar and Turkish forces, and actually also by the Cossacks from Zaporozhian Siege.
В кінці 18 століття Польщу поділили між собою Австрія, Німеччина і Росія, і таким чином Західна Україна разом з Львовом відійшли до Австро-Угорщини. І в Львові з'явилися австрійські урядовці, чиновники і еліти.
As we know, during the final third of the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and Russia. As part of the first partition in 1772, the most western Ukrainian lands around Lviv went to the Habsburg crown, and so the city became part of the Austrian state and bureaucratic system.
Умови культурного життя для будь-яких націй в Австро-Угорщині були, можна сказати, навіть ідеальні, оскільки кожна нація мала змогу розвиватися, зберегти свою культуру, мову і таким чином зберегти себе.
The Habsburg Empire, later known as Austria-Hungary, after 1867, was one of the most unique nations within Europe in that it granted considerable ethnic and cultural autonomy to the many peoples that formed this diverse state.
Австрія дозволила українські університети у Львові і в Чернівцях, і там зосередилися великі наукові сили, а також це дало змогу рости національній еліті українській.
The Austrians allowed Ukrainian universities to be founded in Lviv, known in German at the time as Lemberg, and in Chernivtsi, known at the time in German as Chernovitz, and those two cities we had a possibility for free development of Ukrainian culture and the nourishment and development of a Ukrainian cultural elite.
Львів і ширше Галичину називають українським Києвом, тому що 100 років від початку 19 століття до 1906 року Галичина була осередком всієї української культури.
Lviv and the area of eastern Galicia around it is known as the Piedmont of Ukrainian Risorgimento because this was the territory where Ukrainian idea was nourished and developed through most of the 19th century up until in 1906 finally Ukrainian language was temporarily unbanned in the Russian Empire.
Австрійські імператори завжди мали якийсь сентимент до українців. Один з нащадків, який мав посісти цісарський трон, Вільгельм Габсбург, навіть вивчився українською мовою і видав збірку віршів українською мовою, і також воював у рядах українських січових-стрільців під час Першої війни.
The Habsburg imperial family had warm sentiments towards the Ukrainians. Specifically, you may have heard about Archduke William of Wilhelm von Habsburg, who became the biggest fan and advocate of Ukrainian culture, learned Ukrainian fluently, wrote poetry in Ukrainian, and fought in Ukrainian independent army during the Civil War and the fight for independence between 1917 and 1920. Adding for myself, those of you, who are interested in Ukrainian history, Timothy Snyder of Yale has written an excellent biography of Archduke William, aka in Ukrainian Vasil Vishovany.
В 45-му році його арештували НКВДисти у Відні, звинувачивши в українському націоналізмі і знищили.
In 1945, he was arrested in Vienna by the Soviet Secret Service, and he died in prison in Kiev shortly thereafter.
І таким чином, а вже після Першої світової війни Львів став польським, і тут вже було тільки три народи і три культури – польська, німецька і єврейська.
After World War I, when Lviv became part of the newly reconstituted independent Poland, there we can talk about the dominance of three major cultures: Polish, Jewish, Немецka?
Ні, єврейська, польська і українська.
So not the Germans. So of the original four, the German community almost disappeared. So it was Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish.
А після Другої світової війни Львів повністю втратив населення, тобто десь 90% цього населення зникло, одні були вивезені, інші емігрували, євреї були знищені, і населення Львова змінилося настільки докорінно, що процент галичан був вже не надто великий.
Unfortunately, due to the dramatic events of World War II, the city lost 90% of its pre-war residents. Some were deported by the Soviets, some fled and emigrated to the West. The most tragic, of course, was the fate of the Jewish community, most of which perished during the Holocaust. As a result, after World War II, the city acquired, mostly completely new residents, over 90%, and the residents of those early days of even local areas of eastern Galicia constituted a relative minority.
Але незважаючи на це, не нові львів'яни вплинули на місто, а місто якимось містичним чином вплинуло на цих нових львів'ян і змусило їх закохатися в себе.
But the fascinating and amazing thing is that not that those new residents transformed the character of the city, but somehow the city magically, amazingly turned those new residents into completely different people and made them fall in love with the city and its traditions and reclaim them.
У нас зараз видаються дуже багато книг, досліджень про Львів, і серед авторів цих книжок є багато не тільки людей, які не є українцями, але це люди, які приїхали з Росії, але полюбили Львів і стали запеклими збирачами будь-яких найменших дрібничок про це місто.
We now have a lot of people fascinated with local history and culture, and a lot of new publications coming out about the history and its unique traditions. And many of those are written not necessarily by the natives of the city. People from all over, including, in fact, Russia, are coming there and trying to collect those cultural materials and publish them.
І якщо говорити про мене, то мені завжди бракувало, що Львів закритий якось духовно для дітей, в той час, як в Європі, я знаю, вийшли легенди Праги, легенди Братислави, легенди Лондона і так далі.
So, as for my perspective, one thing that has long bothered me is that this tradition, this mythology of the city was somehow not shared with the young readers, with children, even though I know that there are wonderful books have been written and published about such great cities as Prague or London that are specifically aimed at the younger readership and tells about its colorful history and culture.
Ось, я почав шукати оці легенди в різних старих збірниках, в архівах, в старих газетах, і таким чином з'явився перший том, а незабаром другий том, де були не тільки українські, польські легенди, але а також єврейські.
So I started archival research through archival materials, through old periodicals, through interviews, and I put together an anthology of legends of the city of Lviv. And at first it was one volume, and then it was the second volume of it was published, and it included the legends that come from the three major communities, the Polish, the Ukrainian, and the Jewish, that resided in the city.
Треба сказати, що в старих львівських газетах можна було знайти дуже багато цікавого матеріалу. Газети заохочували читачів присилати якісь історії про духів, якісь жахіття і так далі. І завдяки цьому мені вдалося якось відтворити оцей пласт легенд на готичну тему.
Fascinatingly, actually, it was mostly the old periodicals which, strange as it may seem, encouraged people to submit stories about various supernatural events happening in their places and things of that nature. So I was able to gather quite a few of those and create this anthology of lovely texts with a Gothic tinge about how the old city was lived.
Ці легенди перевидаються щороку, їх діти вивчають в школах, влаштовують екскурсії за цими легендами.
And these books have enjoyed great success. They are now part of the local history curriculum in secondary schools. The new printings are done every year, and there are even tours, guided tours for children that are being led, and sometimes by other children, about the city of Lviv and the legends of its old times.
Легенди Львова перекладені чеською, польською, російською.
And this collection has now been translated into Polish, Czech, and Russian.
Після того я написав ще кілька книжок про Львів. Це є «Кнайпи Львова», про старі львівські ресторани, шинки, корчми і так далі, де збиралися і бандити, і львівська богема. І там теж дуже багато цікавих історій. Ця книжка вийшла також у Польщі.
The next project that I undertook was a book called Knajpy Lvova, which is a book about taverns of various kinds, bars, restaurants, where different colorful characters gathered from the Bohemian artistic circle to people from the criminal underworld. This book has also been very popular both in Ukrainian and in Polish translation.
Також я видав книжку «Таємниці львівської кави», «Таємниці львівської горілки», «Таємниці галицької кухні», бо мене в першу чергу цікавить, чим жили львів'яни, а не історія самого міста, а тільки історія побуту.
So I was really fascinated by the everyday history of details of everyday life. So I continued with the projects, and these were books which are called The Mysteries of Lviv Coffee, The Mysteries of Lviv Vodka, and The Mysteries of the Galician Cuisine, each of which tried to, these are not collections of recipes, but these are collections of stories about the traditions of local material culture and people's everyday life, and trying to recapture that flavor and bring it to the modern readership.
Одним з таких цікавих феноменів Львова були батяри.
Okay, one of the most fascinating phenomena of the city of Lviv were the colorful sort of underworld characters which are known as batyari, who were sort of between the Bohemian artistic circles and the criminal underworld. They had their own folklore, they had their own argot, if you wish, the special language that they spoke. And so the traditions of the batyari are really something that has been attractive and fascinating for many contemporary readers and people interested in the culture of the city and its history.
Я переклав ці батярські пісні на сучасну мову, їх виконує батяр-бенд. І вже 6 років відбувається у нас у Львові Дні батяра, коли багато львів'ян передягаються в батярів, лунаються пісні, батярські танці і так далі. І це вже стало якоюсь такою традицією, за якою спостерігають тисячі туристів.
And so my project was to translate some of these old batyar songs into modern Ukrainian. And there is a band called the Batyar Band which performs them. And for the past 6 years we have the Batyar Festival in the city where often the regular Lvivites dress up as the Batyari. And this has become a major attraction where out-of-town visitors come and enjoy too this as a colorful street festival.
До війни у Львові був сурмач, який сурмив певні години, а вже після війни ясна річ його не було. І я останні кілька років добивався того, щоб знову з'явився сурмач на ратуші. Мені це вдалося зробити після кількох моїх розлючених статей, тому що всі казали, добре, це гарна ідея, але ніхто не хотів нічого робити. І врешті-решт сурмач є, і знову ж таки це приймання дуже туристів, які чекають, коли буде сурмити.
Another interesting detail, traditionally, up until the end of World War II, there was a trumpeter who would announce the hours from the top of the bell tower, of the tower of the city hall in the middle of the Renaissance Market Square in the heart of the city. During the Soviet rule, this tradition stopped, and more recently I was trying to have this tradition resurrected, and as of very recently it has been resurrected. We now again have a trumpeter at the tower of the city hall, and again this has been one of the great successes in reviving the city's cultural tradition, and again this is something that is much loved by both the locals and the visitors.
Теперішня міфологія Львова нерозривно зв'язана з містифікацією, тому що в деяких моментах з'являються такі містифікаційні речі, як, наприклад, пам'ятник художнику-продюсеру Никифору, який сидить з піднятим пальцем, і всі туристи вірять, що якщо погладити цей палець, можна загадати якесь бажання.
in this modern cultural life, there is a lot of new mythologies and new mystifications that are being created. So not all of it has to be taken on faith. One of the more curious and amusing ones, there is a well-known statue to the local Henri Rousseau, the famous primitive painter Nicephore, and he has his index finger raised, and so the tourists are all told that you have to rub that finger if you want to have your dreams come true.
З таким самим великим бажанням вони запихають руку в кишеню пам'ятника Захара Мазоха.
They are just as happy. There is a statue of one of the best-known sons of the city of Lviv, the Austrian-German language writer Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, and the tourists have the possibility to stick their hands in his trouser pockets, and they all do that.
Найкомедніша містифікація – це львівська копальня кави, де на повному серйозі в підвалах шахтарі, вбрані в шахтарський одяг, кайлами дубають стіни і допивають каву, а туристи вірять, що справді кава, родовище кави відкриті у Львові.
And the most amusing legend of this kind was the Lviv coffee mine, where they actually have a mine with miners underground, supposedly going with their pickaxes at the mineral coffee that is contained underneath the city of Lviv, and some gullible tourists actually fall for it.
Все це робиться, ясна річ, для того, щоб заманити туристів.
A lot of these things are done, of course, to attract tourists to the city. So that would be one perspective.
Я ще скажу, що ось це остання моя книжка, це антологія львівської літератури, перший том, куди війшла середньовічна література і 19 століття.
So this book, the Lviv Anthology Volume 1, is the latest publication project of our guest. It is an anthology of writings by local authors and about the city from the medieval times through the end of the 19th century. Further volumes are planned.
Дякую, Юрко.
So, picking up with where Yuri left off, indeed, this is a city that has created a very colorful and very popular mythology that shows very well and sells very well to foreign visitors. I can tell you from my personal experience of leading study abroad tours to Ukraine that Lviv has the best organized infrastructure, in my experience, the nicest, not outrageously Soviet style, post-Soviet style expensive hotels. Hotels are cheaper. The service is European quality and not rude ex-Soviet quality. The tourist guides are knowledgeable and friendly, and the students have really loved it. We are very fortunate at KU in that we have a regular study abroad program, intensive summer program led by Alex Tsov. And I wish this program long years and energy and success, because KU now is a unique institution. It is the only major university in the US which has its own independent study abroad program in Ukraine running at the moment. So we should be really proud, and we should also understand our responsibility, because we are the ones who are the only ones carrying the torch right now. So we have a great pressure on our shoulders. There are, of course, excellent educational partners to be had in the city of Lviv. It's a city of many institutions of higher learning, and it's the city which is very receptive to foreign students. There is the Lviv University, Lviv Ivano-Franko University, which is the main state university in the city, and they are KU's partner for our study abroad program. It is a school with long traditions from the Habsburg days, and It's in a beautiful Habsburg era building, and its scholarly traditions are very, very strong. There is also Lvivska Polytechnika, the Lviv Polytechnic University. Even though it's a school focused on science and technology, they have an excellent Ukrainian language and culture program for foreigners as well. And last but not least, Lviv is also a host to the Ukrainian Catholic University, the first, probably the best Western-style elite university that has emerged. It's affiliated with the Greek Catholic Church, and it's a university that is very actually open-minded and shows great diversity of opinions. So even though it is church affiliated, it is one of the most open-minded and tolerant institutions within Ukraine. Its founding president, Father Boris Gudyak, now Bishop Gudyak, was a bishop of Greek Catholic Church Exarchate of Western Europe based in Paris, but he's a Harvard history PhD. So it was very important to have a Ukrainian American, native of Syracuse, New York, and a Harvard PhD who was able to build this new institution and have very serious Western-style scholarship and teaching introduced. It is also a campus that is conceived as a residential campus where faculty and students are in close proximity, they're in active interaction, and they are trying to create a Western-style educational campus and space, something that institutions in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe often lack. Lviv is also the host to one of the largest book fairs and literary festivals in Central and Eastern Europe, the Lviv Book Forum. It always takes place in the middle of September, and I was privileged and honored to be there for the first time this year. The occasion was that the Ukrainian translation of my book came out, so I had to do some author appearances, so it was a very pleasant duty to have. But again, it is truly amazing and vibrant, especially considering that the precarious economic situation of that place, the post-Soviet space at large, and Ukraine in particular, has not been very conducive to the flourishing of readership and of book publishing industry. And this is a city indeed of the great street culture, of great cafes, great pubs, and where people start dancing tango in the middle of Market Square in the evening. So if you're walking down the street and see random people dancing the tango, do not be alarmed. They do not need to be checked for their mental health. This is actually wonderful aficionados of creating it as a vibrant place of living cultural traditions. The picture is not entirely rosy. I mean, like elsewhere in Ukraine, of course, there are problems too. The authorities are not always efficient. The roads are not in very good shape, like elsewhere in Ukraine, so be prepared for potholes. But I'm happy to report that thanks to Euro 2012, Lviv, in my opinion, now has the best and nicest airport in Ukraine that is completely Western style. And it's much more comfortable than any other airport in Ukraine I've been. So you will have a horrifying taxi ride through the potholes to get from the airport to downtown, but the airport is perfect and the historic downtown is absolutely lovely. But I think we should probably pass on to John and his reflections, and then hopefully afterwards I will have some time left for discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to give, I guess, some of my impressions. I hope there will be some coherence to it, but I have been to Lviv on 2 KU summer programs, and then I also lived there in the 2011-12 academic year. And so I spent most of my time with college, graduate school age, and young professionals there, and there seemed to be in the circles that I was hanging out with a great interest in participating in cultural events in Lviv, and also connecting with people of international affiliation. So there's a very vibrant kind of culture of meeting in various cafes to practice various languages with others. I mean, there was like French, Polish, Russian, Italian, German, among other, and Ukrainian, of course. And it's sort of, especially with the Euro 2012 occurring and Lviv being chosen as a host city, it seemed like there was a sort of a hyper orientation towards Central and Western Europe in my eyes. And in addition to this was also hearkening back, especially many commercial ventures, towards Lviv's multicultural past, in terms of sort of evoking the interiors of Habsburg era restaurants. For instance, one particular cafe named the Viennese Cafe has Austrian period music every Thursday. Many cafes, particularly restaurants, were, say, interwar Polish themed or Czech themed, and so on. And so it's sort of, this also plays into Ukraine, Lviv's two, I would say at this time, there are two major economic foci. Tourism, of course, and also IT technology. A lot of young people from throughout Ukraine and even some foreign, some other countries in Europe were coming to Lviv to work for various ventures, which were often owned by international groups, but the labor in Lviv is, of course, much cheaper than elsewhere. And along with sort of this tourism, of course, were the many festivals that Mr. Vynnychuk talked about briefly. And I mean, even this last summer, there was a vintage Grand Prix held for a 1930s era Grand Prix circuit, which actually came to Lviv on two occasions in the 30s. And so it was sort of, and it was widely attended, and there was a lot of buzz throughout the city when this happened. And so there's obviously this great sense of cultivating both. There's also great commercial interest in the cultivation of these memories. One thing that I do sort of want to touch on is the commemoration of the Ukrainian Liberation Army, the UPA, who have a sort of a mixed past. They were a group fighting for Ukrainian independence, but also they engaged in acts of ethnic cleansing, and this is sort of a contested area for Ukrainians, and it's especially the memory of UPA is very strong in Lviv, or at least the imagined memory, where you still see UPA flags flying, or there's a very touristy cafe that is modeled on an UPA bunker, from which they engaged in essentially guerrilla warfare against, depending on the time period, perhaps the Germans, the Nazis, the Red Army, or Poles, to simplify it. And so there's sort of this this memory of that, and young people, I would say, were ambivalent towards it, or just kind of thought, in many cases, it was just sort of both good and bad. I mean, it was sort of a neutral, a more ambivalent view of this aspect of Lviv's past. And in the time since I first went to Lviv in 2010 through this summer, it seems to me that there's still celebration, commemoration of UPA and various figures, but to me, it's not something that the young people are as involved in as they were in 2010, in my view. And I suppose I also want to say that that young people are very engaged politically in Lviv. You see a variety of demonstrations happening on the main prospect of boulevard of central Lviv. Just for example, I've seen students protest conditions at the university, and most recently I saw anarchists protesting against wage slavery. So it's sort of Lviv's, I would say, youth culture at least is vibrant, and they all love participating in the various touristy festivals. So that's sort of leave it on.
All right, thank you so much, John. So I mean, probably it will make more sense if we have, questions from the audience and try to, the degree that we can, make it a fuller experience rather than talking at you. Therefore, we'll be delighted to answer. Yes.
I wonder how much interaction there is between Ukrainian communities abroad and various groups in Lviv. I wonder in particular that some of you may remember there was a very funny book published in Britain called, what was it? A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian. I wonder if that book is known in Lviv, or maybe even translated. I have no idea.
Yes, so we can talk about it. Тобто питання таке, наскільки важливими і активними для Львова є зв'язки з українською діаспорою? І цей пан знає, що принаймні серед англомовних читачів була така книжка Марини Левицької, це діаспорна письменниця з Англії, що написала книжку англійською мовою, коротка історія тракторів по-українськи. Яка була реакція на цю книжку Львова?
У Львові цією книжкою не були захоплені, але не тільки в Львові, але й загалом в Україні, бо очевидно там те, що для англійського читача було якимось, можливо, відкриттям, для українського тут вже жодного відкриття не було і сприймалося як звичайна белетристика.
The book was translated into Ukrainian but didn't have great success, in part because this is a book which was intended for a different audience. So something which could have been a revelation for an English reader was not a revelation for the Ukrainian reader, of course.
Львівська діаспора є досить велика, тобто ще галицька діаспора. Я з нею постійно зустрічався, особливо в Канаді. І у них усіх є велика зацікавлення, вони купують усі книжки, які про Львів виходять, приїжджають до Львова, і коли ми робили концерти разом з Віктором Морозом в Канаді, то дуже багато було людей, які дуже тішилися тим.
And however, you are quite correct in that there is a very large diaspora of Lvivites and people who trace their roots to Galicia, and they have taken very keen interest in the city and the region, its culture and history, and its present-day situation. And so there is heritage tourism, but there is also great interest in trying to get to know more. So the books about the city's history and culture by our guests that have been mentioned earlier here, they have had great success among the diaspora circles, especially now in Canada. The diaspora institutions, like diaspora bookstores, are better organized than they are here in the US, even though in absolute numbers there is a bigger Ukrainian diaspora in the US in terms of percentages, because Canada's population is smaller. The Ukrainian community plays a much more visible role in Canada's cultural politics. During this North American tour, the Eastern Canadian portion in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal of our guests' visit here reunited with his friend and colleague, the singer-songwriter Viktor Morozov, and they did a cabaret-style festival concerts of traditional Lviv music, and those events were a huge success. The audience was in many hundreds, completely sold out. So this shows that there is a really keen interest among the diaspora in the traditions and the current culture of the city.
Але я хотів додати, що кількісно українська діаспора зменшується. І щоб порівняти, ми у 89-му році разом з кабаре «На Шорист» дали 8 концертів в Торонто в величезному залі на 600 місць. Це було 6 концертів.
But the older diaspora, of course, unfortunately, its numbers are shrinking with age. Back in 1989, when the Nežuris cabaret, the Don't Worry, Don't Be Sad cabaret, of which our guest and Viktor Morozov were part, first came to Toronto, they sold out 6 concerts in a concert hall for 600 people. This time it was only one event this year. Your question, please.
Yes, sorry, just to switch gears briefly from the cultural to the more political,
Mhm.
economic end of things. The young people that I know in Western Ukraine who went to university in Lviv, went to Brownbag University, there seems to be a growing sense of maybe apathy, I guess you'd call it, or disillusionment with politics in general in Ukraine, especially the central government's politics, but also sort of disillusionment with the future path the country might take, or just the future more generally, especially now the association agreement with the EU might be in jeopardy, and so they don't know if there's a path forward, which direction Ukraine will go. Is that widespread in Western Ukraine, or is that just limited to certain sections of the population?
Okay, well, this probably actually is a good question for all 3 of us. So, Юрку, спочатку питання для тебе. Це чи ж ви кажеш, що спілкуючись з молодими українцями, зокрема студентами, зокрема в університеті Франка у Львові, він відчуває певне розчарування і апатію у порівнянні з трохи старшою генерацією, з генерацією, скажімо, 90-х років, що молодь теперішня, вона менш певна стосовно майбутнього України і її розвитку. Які твої думки?
Звичайно, це є, тому що у нас далі відбуваються якісь дивні речі при владі, коли владу захопили олігархи і різні люди, які займаються тільки збагаченням, і їх абсолютно не цікавить економіка України.
Well, you certainly seized upon something that is a very important phenomenon that is taking place. It is sad but true that power right now in Ukraine has been grabbed by the oligarchs and the people associated with them, and their main goal is padding their own pockets and not improving the lot of the country's population, developing the country's economy or political or social culture.
В Кабінеті міністрів є кілька міністрів, які народилися в Росії, прожили більшість свого свідомого життя там, і тільки недавно з'явилися в Україні, і раптом вони працюють в міністерстві. В тому числі росіянин очолював СБУ, росіянин очолював, і зараз очолює Міністерство оборони.
One of the strange and worrying trends was actually that it wasn't even local Ukrainian ethnic Russians, but recent transplants from Russia proper that have rose to prominent positions within the cabinet of ministers in the current Ukrainian government. So when somebody who until recently worked in Russia all of a sudden becomes the head of Ukraine's security services or Ukraine's Minister of Defense, this shows that the current powers that be are directing things in very particular direction.
У мене брав інтерв'ю від відомий німецький політолог Герхард Шредер. Я його запитав, чи можливо таке, щоб в Німеччині Міністерство оборони очолив француз. Він сказав, що можливо. Я кажу, а було таке? Я кажу, ні.
When I was interviewed by a German political scientist, I asked him, actually, can you imagine that a French citizen, a recent transplant from France, all of a sudden becomes a Minister of Defense in Germany? He said, well, theoretically it's possible. And then I asked him, and has it ever happened? No. I would add from my own perspective that indeed, just this morning I was reading a blog post by a local younger poet from Lviv, Ostap Slavinsky, from his own personal experience teaching undergraduates and giving guest lecture actually to undergraduates, and being shocked that compared to the generation of the 1990s, which was much more hopeful and open-minded and much more absorbed the ideas of liberalism and diversity, within the current generation of college students, in part because of the general degradation of the system of education and the widespread corruption, there is a narrowing of horizons. And you find people with rather shockingly narrow intellectual horizons and rather sadly limited views, and indeed because they see the system as completely corrupt, that creates cultural apathy. Of course, there are exceptions to this trend, and there are young people who are very passionate and very organized. John has mentioned the anarchists. There is indeed non-dogmatic and non-totalitarian left. That is a recent phenomenon on the rise. I wouldn't say that the numbers are huge, but it is certainly an important new phenomenon that has appeared within just the last couple of years. And the universities are the incubators, the hubs of various political trends. So you find among the student populations the whole complete spectrum, from the extreme left to the extreme right. And so looking at the universities, talking to students and seeing what the students are up to is a great way of, sort of feeling the pulse of the country and where it is trending politically. John, what do you think?
I agree with what you said. I've been looking at various opinion polls over the last couple of years, and it's generally like 30 to 40% of Ukrainians, now I think it's in the low 30s, want Ukraine, they think Ukraine should go with the EU, and maybe another 30 or so percent often respond like something closer with Russia in some form. And I guess when I've done some survey data on university students, and for the most part, the university students I got data from, they basically were very in favor of EU integration as opposed to with Russia. But I would say that to some degree this is a larger phenomenon. I mean, when I was talking about the idea of the Eurasian Union with Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia, that is kind of the precursor customs union that has recently come into being. That I gave a presentation at an economics university in Kiev, and the audience was, for the most part, pretty displeased that I was suggesting they might become a part of the Eurasian Union. So I mean, that goes beyond me, right?
Most data I'm not a social scientist, so I'm treading into territory which is not mine but John's, but from what I understand as a dilettante, we basically have not only this 1/3 pro-European integration, 1/3 pro-Russian integration, and 1/3 undecided. The important part also is that there is also a lot of gray area geographically. So when you're trending, there are parts of the country, the west and the center and the capital, which are much more Western oriented, and the areas in the east and the south, which are much more Russian oriented, but there is no clear demarcation, there's no clear boundary line. It's the statistical shift from one to the other, and there are obviously pockets and exceptions, and there are very dedicated and hardworking people in those supposedly pro-Russian regions who are trying to say that no, that's not true, we are not all things like that. So there is actually a big diversity of opinions there. Other questions? Yes, please.
So what about the Jewish community in Lviv now? Is it experiencing an upsurge as many Jewish communities in Poland are?
Якщо ти можеш розповісти про сучасну єврейську громаду у Львові, цей пан каже, що, наскільки він знає, в Польщі зараз піднесення інтересу у єврейській історії, єврейській культурі, зокрема є цей Галицький єврейський музей у Кракові і все таке інше. Тобто, як у Львові це виглядає?
Ну, єврейська громада у Львові це ті євреї, які приїхали з Росії, з України, тому у них корінів немає величини. Галицьких євреїв вижило одиниці. Мені вдалося поспілкуватися лише з двома, які пам'ятали ще часи Голокосту.
The first thing we need to bear in mind that the modern day Jewish community there, these are not direct descendants of the historic Jewish community. These are Jewish people who have moved from other parts of Ukraine or other parts of the former Soviet Union by and large. Our guest has actually actively sought out survivors of the old Jewish community, and he said that he's only had the opportunity for extensive interviewing and discussion with only 2 Jewish survivors who have lived through the Holocaust in this area who were the original natives of pre-war Lviv.
Але інтерес є до тих львівських євреїв, туристів, тому чисто з туристичною метою відкрилася така єврейська ресторація, де все обладнано у єврейському стилі, єврейські страви. І там цікава така річ, що в меню не вказані ціни, а треба з офіціантами торгуватися за ціну, і дуже такі комедії відбуваються сцени.
So what is happening, and this is a bit of a controversial phenomenon, is that like in Poland, where right now Jewish community is very small, but there is the recreation of these things, and as you know, all the klezmer festivals in Krakow by people who have no direct relationship to Jewish culture and things of that nature. Part of the commercial tourist industry is also bringing attention to the old Jewish life and the old Jewish community that used to live there. One of the more controversial, even though popular with tourist places, is a Jewish-themed restaurant within the Renaissance era historic center of the city of Lviv, which recreates life in a traditional shtetl, and one of the controversial aspects of that is that the restaurant's menu does not have prices listed, and it's an intention supposedly that the customers have to haggle with the waiters. So this is one of the problematic instances of how it is the stereotyping of the past cultures, not necessarily the profound understanding of that is going on. I would say that a much more interesting phenomenon is happening around reclaiming writers. Я хочу додати трохи про Бруно Шульца і Йозефа Рота, хоча вони не львів'яни. The 2 great Jewish writers from the first half of the 20th century who were the natives of the region, even though not of the city of Lviv. Bruno Schulz, who wrote in Polish and who was a native of Drohobych, and Josef Roth, who wrote in German and was a native of Brody. Both towns are very short distance from Lviv. They're both very important to Galicia as a history and culture. And especially in the case of Schulz and Drohobych, there is a very interesting multilateral partnership between Americans, Poles, Ukrainians, and there are excellent modern-day translations of Schulz into modern Ukrainian. There are theatrical festivals. There is a Schulz museum. It's some of it. I mean, if you follow the history, you know that there have been some complicated, details. The conflict with Yad Vashem about the frescoes that he did for the Nazi officer before he was unfortunately shot and killed. But this is something that the city and the local intellectuals take very, very seriously. And it's a very serious partnership both with the international Jewish community and with the Ukrainian and Polish literary culture. With Roth and Brody, it's less visible, but Roth's novels have been translated and are very widely read and are very popular. So the acknowledgement that this was an area culturally and historically where there was writing happening in many languages and it was part of many cultures among the intelligentsia, this is certainly very prominent. Another city in the area, Chernetsky, there more members of the Jewish communities there survived the Holocaust because of the specific history of that part, which was annexed to Romania during the war. So there we have a little more of a continuity there too, as in Lviv we now have literary festivals and a great coordination. In that case, it is also with the German-speaking community and German culture, especially with Paul Celan and the memory, but also the other writers writing in Yiddish and writing in German. So I would say both these cities are taking the culture seriously, but it's more focused on the history and reclaiming it for both the outsiders who trace their roots, but also for the local community. And so there is the great interest to the politics of memory. In Lviv, there's a wonderful independent academic institution which is called Центр міської історії, the Center for Urban History of East Central Europe, who host wonderful events. They host summer schools in Jewish studies, which are really outstanding and top-notch. They do excellent research and publications in the field. So there is certainly vibrant intellectual presence as far as ties to the Jewish community. Then there, of course, is heritage tourism. And when I was bringing my own students as a study abroad group, we certainly made sure to include the Jewish history of the city as a very prominent part of what we saw. And the problem is, as you know, during Soviet rule, the specificity of Jewish suffering during the war was not something that could be discussed openly. Therefore, the politics of memory within the post-Soviet period has had to go through many complicated developments. But hopefully, there is, I think, light at the end of the tunnel because there are local enthusiasts, because there are events like that, summer school at the Center for Urban History, and hopefully there'll be more good events like that happening.
I'm happy to hear you mention Harold Binder's Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Has our guest participated with the Center for Urban History of East Central Europe?
Юрку, чи ти мав можливість якось контактувати з Центром міської історії там у Львові, бо вони всілякі заходи проходять, що намагаються якось?
Влітку відбулася презентація мого роману, і там було присутнє товариство єврейське на цьому.
Yes, most recently the novel he was presenting yesterday, The Tango of Death, which is the first thematization of the Holocaust in a major way in contemporary Ukrainian literature. There was a presentation of the book. There were many members of the local Jew, at the Center for Urban History, there were many members of the local Jewish community who came, and there was very avid and lively discussion.
Thank you.
Well, as much as I hate to say it, I think our time is at an end. I want to thank our speakers today.